Hello and welcome to Just a Dog podcast. I am your host, Nadine. Joining me this week is Rose Bao. Rose is a dedicated canine behaviorist, counselor, and coach, guided by fear-free principles and a deep respect for the emotional lives of dogs and their humans. Rose holds a first-class honours degree in biomedical engineering and is currently completing a master's in clinical animal behaviour at the University of Edinburgh, with a special interest in chronic pain. Her research interests also extend to anthrozoology, focusing on how agency, power, and identity intersect in dog training cultures. She is both an intersectional voice and a trusted partner in helping guardians navigate the emotional landscapes of reactivity, trauma, and recovery. On a personal note, I absolutely love this conversation with Rose. We pull on a variety of different threads, leaning in with curiosity to see where it leads. And our hope is that it plants a seed for you to help you consider life with your dog from an ever so slightly different perspective. It's not about what's right or wrong, but rather being able to identify some of the cognitive biases that we might hold that are yet to be questioned or reflected upon. I really hope that you listen to all of this episode. I found it wholly fascinating, as it really tickled parts of my brain that I feel haven't been tickled in quite some time. I hope that it will do the same for you. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Rose Bao. Enjoy. Hi Rose, it's so lovely to see you. I'm so glad you could join me today, all the way from Australia. How are you?
I'm doing on a scale of solid to liquid, probably closer to the solid end, but probably like honey. Like I can go with the flow, but I'm quite anchored in this moment, held together. That's
I love that. Yeah, I love that. So, Rose, let's start at the very beginning. I would love to learn more about your journey, how you started working with dogs, and also your personal experience with your first dog, I think, called Bruno.
Oh, he's so many things, and this journey it's been a big journey, and I'd say in a relatively short amount of time, which I'm very grateful for. So I guess if I go back to beginning, like as a kid, I don't know that I was always a dog person, which feels quite shocking because like I'm so deeply passionate about dogs and dog people now, but I wasn't always. I guess they were kind of around the periphery. Like neighbors had dogs, friends had dogs, and maybe they'd visit once or twice, but it was never like I guess I never had like a really deep bond with the dog until my first dog, which was later on. But at the beginning, like as a kid, I'd say I was actually more connected with rabbits and guinea pigs. So I wasn't always a dog person. I bonded really with the small animals. And it was when I got my first dog, which is like relatively a small time ago, 5 years ago, and that was like right before the peak of COVID, like before everything went like shut in.
Yeah.
That was like the sort of catalyst to everything, to even just, I guess, a huge change in how I understand or how I think about dogs and how I start to question how people have relationships with dogs, but also a shift in, I think, my identity and my sense of self. And just, it was a lot of things. It was a catalyst for this journey of going on to look at and understand dogs and dog people, but also to then introspect on myself and like my relation with the world. So it was big. Like Bruno was big for just like 5 years ago. And so I guess a quick story, or not the quick, but the long story short of Bruno is, at the time, I'd convinced my dad that it was a good thing for the family to have a dog, not knowing nearly enough of like, what I needed to. As I go, first time, really excited. Honestly, child, I still think of, my brain at that point in thinking about the dog and what I expected of it as like, like that kiddo Rose. It feels like a very young Rose. So convinced Dad, we actually went on Gumtree, which is like, we have to, I think, obligatory, have to go down that journey. So we actually went on Gumtree, and then we rocked up to this very dodgy front yard, and then these 3 little puppies crawled out. And then there was like a supposed mum dog that came out, who's actually, I think in hindsight, quite a friendly dog. I do think that, like, thinking about the image of her and her interactions, I was like, oh, that's actually quite a lovely, like I don't get to see a lot of dogs and have greetings with a lot of dogs like that. But, who knows if that was really mum. So we picked up one of those 3 puppies, and that was the start of Bruno. He was a very boisterous kiddo. On our very first vet visit is when a big alarm bell which wasn't as alarming at the time as it sort of needed to be. But a big alarm bell for Bruno was he actually had they picked up on a very significant heart murmur for him. So where I guess a normal heart would sound like lub dub, like quite like rhythmic, his had a kind of whooshing sound. So the sound was quite irregular and was not normal. And then I think in that moment, I didn't know like the repercussions of all of these things. In the moment, it just felt very gut wrenching, this potential that I might not be with this dog for a very long time, and like reconciling that with, just how much life I wanted to have with him. But again, it didn't like hit me. That was just like the beginning. And as Bruno was growing up, it was like, as he was growing up, I'd say I mentally was also still growing up as well. I think looking back on me at that time, I think I was quite naive, but like still really excited. So I guess it was like two kiddos almost growing up together. Yeah. And then like as he was growing up, I was learning the ropes as we went. And so, like making mistakes, but also doing some things right, overdoing some things, like overly taking him out and exposing him, but also, not doing certain things like helping him get exposed to grooming at home, that kind of thing. So just a little bit all over the shop, but still trying my best and trying really hard. And pretty early on, even in puppy class, we did go to puppy classes. He was a very big feeling dog very early on. Like all the other puppies were quite, how I would describe them, knowing what I know now, like they could regulate. They're like, oh yeah, I guess I'm here. Oh yeah, that one's intense. Oh, that could be. Oh, okay, mommy wants me to just sit here. But like Bruno's like any dog. Oh yeah. And then so I literally have like chicken, like little bits of chicken and cooked chicken cut up, and I just have to help him help station him on a little mat. The whole 40 minutes of class, which is also a very big session for the dog. Yeah. But yeah, just very early on, we had this medical issue come up where what it's saying underlying is his heart. There were some structural abnormalities with his heart. The heart murmur doesn't always mean that, but what it grew into was a pretty big structural abnormality. And at the same time, his behavior presentations was very big. It was hard for him to take on what I would say a average puppy's amount of tolerable stimulation was. So as he grew up, I'd say the 5-6 month mark was really, really hard, was when he was wanting to do a lot more things. We'd sort of come out of this early as a puppy, very biddable puppy, like even having big feelings. It felt relatively easy to just communicate with him and ask him to come over and do these things. And as he rolled into adolescence and gone into adolescent brain of, I want to do these new things and I have no impulse control or no sense of self-preservation. So, and I, probably if we look at his functional group, he was a German Shepherd cattle dog. And I would say quite determined. And it was like what maybe started out as, okay, like this is a very boisterous dog. There are some challenges here. It became a very frustrating experience for me. So I remember like hitting a very hard point where I was feeling that he was really actually difficult to be with, but not to the point where I felt resigned and I wanted to like throw the towel in, but that I just felt really helpless. And that what I understood at the time was, okay, the dogs that they need to go out for a walk. And my struggle at the time, like when he was getting into that 6-7 month mark, was he would actually be really upset with having equipment on, harness on. When he'd finally be convinced to have the equipment on, getting in the car, he would actually drool so much to like, he would be like falling down his front feet, how much drool is actually happening, which is like in hindsight, like that, he's very nauseous and very uncomfortable and very nervous. But at that time, my understandings of, what metric of a happy dog was that he had to be going out and having these experiences outside and getting to know more of the world. And so it got really hard in that putting on equipment was hard. Getting him through the car ride, even into the car, was really hard. He's growing quite big at that point as well. And then the second that he would see a dog, previously what was, oh my God, like just, I'm quite interested. Oh, Mummy's got chicken. Was now even seeing a dog maybe like 25-30 meters away, he'd actually break into a big scream, howl, bark. It was very it was very emotional, and it was like he was emotional, and I was very emotional because at the time I didn't know how to actually. I wasn't as in check with my own emotions as well, let alone to even fathom his. So then there were a few things at home where, he'd find it quite hard to be alone at certain times. It was hard to juggle his schedule, my schedule. I was just finishing uni as well. And then at that 7-8 month mark was unfortunately when I discovered balanced training, or the idea of using punishment to quote unquote correct behavior. And at that point in time, I think that was compatible to maybe the kind of like the parenting that I'd grown up with, or just the kind of modeling of authority and adult child kind of relationships. So I was like, okay, I guess this kind of makes sense. And I think a lot of that, like the language and the way that people talk about that can be like very convincing that this is the right thing to do, and that, you develop these very resilient and robust and I guess dogs who are able to then be afforded more freedom later on. So I really bought into that idea of, I guess, suppressing. And so he went through desexing, which was already risky for him, given at that point we were doing echocardiograms every few months and it was coming out. So his diagnosis was he had pulmonic stenosis. So one of his main heart valves, instead of actually letting blood through normally, it was actually quite fused. So there's a very little like space for blood to actually go through. And so even like going under anesthesia is quite risky. So we went through desexing, cool. And then before we got to 12 months was when we agreed we'd do heart surgery for him. And what was crazy was at the time, I didn't conceptualize that had anything to do with his behavior, like his way of relating to the world. In my head, it was just completely separate. Like that's just training. And then this is like, perhaps I don't even know how I would have empathized with that. I think in my head, I'd just imagined that it was like a little bit of an inconvenience for him, when really, like, his whole heart doesn't work the way that it should, right? And so 11 months, we go into surgery. Actually, before we even get to the surgery table, we did a nice thing. And like, it was a very nice holiday. We went on a little road trip with Bruno to a farm stay. And then it was the first time where like we took off all of those correctional tools and just didn't think about that. And then he was like, it was so liberating to just see him be able to enjoy without me having to do all of this navigating, and without me having to be like this authoritative, like, and controlling, person with him. I always think about that moment, that I had such a sweet, like a glimpse of what life could be like when we start thinking about, what kind of environments really help him thrive without me having to do these things. We could take him into surgery the next day, and then he has a heart attack on the surgery table and they cannot resuscitate him, which was like, that is a grief that I would not wish on even like my, the worst enemies. It was so horrifying just how sudden like everything was, when we just got this, like I was just starting to have insight on, hang on, if I took him out to this farm, he's actually quite a lovely dog. Like I think that I understand him a little bit. And then like it followed with that sudden loss where I wasn't even able to be with him. I think that was the hardest thing, was I sort of just sent him into the room and I was like, be strong, be resilient, you'll be fine. And then, thinking about it's been an emotional.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for your loss. That's devastating.
Yeah, I'm also like certain it's the time of the month for me. So I'm like really sitting in the feels today, I
That's
think. But
good. You're in the right
yeah,
place.
I am. And I do like to like tap back into those. I really appreciate this question, because sometimes I get really bogged down on like the work today, that I forget how much like, went into the who we are today. So that was big, was I think the 3 months after, I just like blacked out. I don't know what really, I don't know what happened, but the journey from there, I think that emotional event, it did a lot of things. It like sent me to like the deepest place that I had been, but it was important to be able to start climbing out of it and seeing new things. I think I'm like, as painful as it was, every time I reflect on the journey with Bruno, I don't know that I could have been the person that I needed to be had he not, left the way that he did. And then the second, actually, I guess that was the biggest thing, is it was so painful, but it also just then opened up space for me to actually be so incredibly emotional that I needed to know how to deal with my emotions. And I think that 2 years after Bruno was a lot of me starting to realize that I was also a very emotional person. I'd just not thought about it. I hadn't become aware of it until that point, until I was like, this isn't, why do I get really overwhelmed? And then when I get overwhelmed, I cannot breathe. And then I'm on the floor, at that same point, I started working with dog trainers and just shadowing different dog trainers. My understanding of working with dogs at the time was limited to just the local trainers around me. And I just thought that, okay, I guess working with dogs just means training them. And so I was reaching out to different trainers and just shadowing their classes and just picking up bits here and there and learning how they interacted with people. And at the same time, I was going through these personal things, personal relationships with my family. There were so many things bubbling up that sort of forced me to realize that I don't know if I quite know what emotions are. And I think maybe a lot of Asian immigrant children also get to this point if they're not kind of shown that from their parents. And I think a lot of our parents wouldn't have been allowed to feel, you know what I mean? There's so much suppression that just gets sort of passed down. So that all surfaced up in a very short amount of time. And I started going to see a therapist, which is when the parallels of what Bruno would have been going through would have been emotions. That would have been emotional. And I guess you don't punish a kid who's having a meltdown because that hurt, because the kid went, I'm hurt, but I don't know how else to present this other than I need to yell at you because it must be your fault. You know what I mean? That's a kid.
Listen to me, listen. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think it didn't occur to me that, I guess, my own behavior presentations are similar. It comes from an emotional place of, often it is hurt, but then comes out in this you need to go away, or I'm going away, I'm hiding forever, you can't speak to, you know what I mean? And I go, oh, okay, I kind of get it now. And then I think that was when that aha moment happened, that okay, it's not actually just about training, that there's a little bit more. We're actually emotional creatures, emotional beings, and sometimes we do need to co-regulate, and sometimes we're also misunderstood. And then after, I'd say that 2 years into grieving Bruno, moving forward, I guess, not on, but moving, forward, then I would call them creature teachers. I would pet sit dogs, and then I would start doing pet sitting while training them. And at the same time, I would pick up these short courses there's an organization called the IAABC, where it's just a big, I guess, educational resource. And they have a lot of different professionals there who provide talks. And that's when I started going down the road of, okay, we're looking into what are some behavioral issues? What are the roots of them? That's more than just, I've learned that if I bark, then I get a treat, therefore I do it again. What is more than that?
Yeah.
And then with creature teachers, I think there's so many, and I've had not just Bruno pass away, but I had a very special dog who's actually, if you've seen on my Instagram, he's a golden retriever who I've been able to look after since he was a puppy, and who sort of grew with me into the learnings that I have today. When I say brother, it's the doggo that his parents previously had, is called Gojo, and he was a border collie. He's now a little elephant on my arm. He also was a COVID doggo who passed away really young from chronic kidney disease. And he passed away only when he was 2 years old, but he was the most gentle, and the most he was so receptive to anything that any inclination, any intention that you might signal. He's where do you want me? What, I can do it. I'll try my best. And he was there were things that he struggled with too. He found strangers quite complicated and difficult, but I think he would have been a really big push into almost teaching me how to be quite gentle with myself and then gentle with other doggos. And then very funnily, his brother being the doggo that they got after Gojo, Kare, is so many things. He's so many big feelings packaged in also a very gentle yet quite endearing and demanding way. It's he's a very special doggo. And then so Gojo had chronic kidney disease. Kare has bilateral hip dysplasia and a few things going on for him. And he is the doggo who I walked with through this, I guess, through the start of the chronic pain, like really understanding that for dogs. And then Kare opened the door to the last 2 years of my life of really deep diving, like what is more, really like what is like holistic healthcare actually look like for a doggo. And when we think about behavior, of course, I would find the world really challenging if I had this physical limitation, if I had this pebble in my shoe or a torn ACL that I just can't tell you. And I try to, but you just don't understand. You won't listen. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Such, I could listen to you forever. You're a very good
Really?
storyteller. Honestly, what a tragic story. I think, firstly, is your current why powered by Bruno? Or,
It's still powered by Bruno. It's still and it's almost like the meaning of his passing and the meaning of what we had just keeps evolving and getting deeper the more that I know, because it just feels, I guess I just feel more and more grateful every year that I just get to learn more because I have the capacity to, because I wouldn't have if he was still with me. You know what I mean? Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Do you know, I'm wondering whether you, at any point between then and now, made a connection between how it wasn't like his illness and then Gojo and Corey's illnesses or physical ailments.
Yeah.
There's a connection between them and the way that they were bred rather than luck of the draw.
I think definitely. I think, and probably in hindsight, maybe a year ago, in reflecting on this COVID boom of puppies, even I think it was most apparent when I started running puppy classes myself. So last year I hosted a few puppy classes at Pet-O, and when I was seeing the doggos and when I had been taught to start looking at how does a dog move and how do they not move, and therefore what does that say about what they can and cannot do, and in very subtle ways, I think it became very apparent, like looking at these new puppies coming out, that I think it reflected a big issue in Australia, that because we're an island, our gene pool is very small, and so there's a high, I guess, percentage of inbredness that comes with a lot of breeds. And what that can look like is these conformations that are not quite efficient for the body or efficient for what behaviorally we sort of work them into doing. I guess an example could be that if we think about, say, German Shepherds, I think we have a lot of German Shepherds in Australia, and we see them in all these different shapes and sizes and with all sorts of slopes and of backs. And I guess what they were created to do is to be working with a human, especially livestock. And then we've also sort of evolved them to work as, guardians of the household, guardians of the farm. And I think what I understand of where German Shepherd lines started is they're actually quite small. They're supposed to be quite small to be functionally or to align with what they were created for. And so now we're seeing all of these different mixes, and like when we bring two different breeds together, it does become, I guess in a way it is a little bit of a what do we call it? A draw. What did you call it?
A luck of the draw.
Yeah, of actually how sound this doggo's conformation is going to be, and that this, like, how sound this dog's health is going to be just because of like how we are creating them. Does that make sense? So I guess like genetics is such a big influence in the physical health and then subsequently behavioral health, but also like standalone, like, their personality and then, predisposition to feeling quite pessimistically about the world. It has a super big influence on that. And I think, yeah, I guess that becomes more and more apparent each year. And probably last year, seeing in my own puppy cohorts just how drastic some of the puppies could be in what I would expect of like how much is tolerable for an average puppy. Yeah. And in those puppy classes, I would say quite, not game changing, but not conventional things where we're not teaching sits and stays. We're actually just teaching, can they explore their own little space that's quite far from each other when they've got, little snuffles and licky mats set up, and we're getting them introduced to these tools that will help them regulate. And you'll see of such a big spectrum of puppies. Like some puppies are like, oh yeah, cool. But actually very few puppies are like, oh yeah, cool, I have a sniff over here. And a lot of puppies are like, oh my God, there's all sorts going on. This is very overwhelming. Yeah. I think,
Is that socialization? Is that connected to socialization or being taken away from the mummy and
yeah,
litter too soon? Or is that genetics?
it could be all three. So we have studies now suggesting that the epigenetics, so how stressed mum was as mum, or what the experience of the puppies were like in the womb and in those first 2 weeks of early rearing, how much kind of neurological stimulation, too much, too little, can impact their later life resilience. There's a lot of factors that I guess when I meet parents would have been out of their control that would have shaped a lot of the foundations of the doggo that they have. And then we kind of have to, I guess, come into an acceptance that that is now a part of it and it's what we're working with, but it doesn't define doggo. But it is undeniably a big part. It is undeniably a big part of, I guess, what doggo can, might not, or can do, might not be able to do, might not want to do. Yeah, 100%.
Knowing what you know now, because you've been down so many rabbit holes, if you could go back in time, what would you do differently with regards to how you found and selected Bruno, all the way
Yeah,
through to like how you managed his big feelings, I guess?
it's a very good question. It's a very big question because I feel like
It
a
is.
gut part of me would have answered, I don't know that I would have gotten a doggo at the time. I don't know that I should have gotten a doggo at the time because of, I guess, the risk of how, of these kinds of physical ailments on our doggos, physical limitations, because of how we are creating them, because of like the poor oversight on how we are creating and producing these litters and who is doing that. I think it is very common for doggos to experience or to have like higher needs than what we would expect maybe 10 years ago when like much lower number of dogs. And I hate to like think about it in terms of like mass production, but it's a little bit like that where we go into mass production, you cannot control the quality. And I hate thinking about it like that, but I feel like when we think of it, we think of the system that we're in. I think that's a lot of what we're battling is one of the root causes is we're really having to think about the ethics of producing the dogs and I guess the ethics of the legal environment that we're putting or maybe not putting enough on that process, which would make me go, I don't know at the time, given my maturity and my resources financially as well as emotionally, that I would have been ready to take on a doggo and to have good mental health in that initial kind of learning process, if that makes sense. That's what my gut would say. I also have this debacle in my head of when I talk about like the production or the creating of the doggos, I also then have this debacle of, well, who gets to say whose life is more worthy? And then I go, I also think about, would I have gotten a rescue dog and what other things that I would need to think about then. I just overall, I guess I don't know how to answer that question yet, but I probably would have been in the boat of at least where I am right now, knowing what I know. I know that I am not ready for a doggo, but I'm also aware of how wonderful and how wonderfully insightful a life with them to such closeness would be. I think I get to enjoy that as someone who gets to be involved in the doses. I think of myself as like an auntie where I'm supposed to be a little bit animal behaviorist / the future role of clinical animal behaviorist is supposed to be more like psychologist. But I feel like with the doggo industry, we do get to be a little bit closer with the dog and we do get to, I guess, enjoy the personal experience with them a little bit. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
yes, I enjoy this auntie-hood
that's
for
amazing.
a lot of doggos and to be able to walk with people on their journeys. But I don't know that I'd be ready to go on one yet. But the cat, we do have a cat. Also, it's good perspective to have because when we think about cats, the process of domestication we did not go as far with them as we did with the dogs. With the dogs, we need them to be completely, to an extent, the certain groups of doggos that we've made, we need them to be completely dependent on us. And so you do have these dogs where they're like, hey, I do need your help. And then at the same time, I feel like as a society, what we've been told to do is they shouldn't be that needy. That's too much attention that you're asking for.
Yeah.
I think that's like the interesting pathway that the doggos have gone down. With cats, we haven't gone that far into domestication for them. A little bit, but not to the extent where they're actually dependent on us. They're so socially obligate on us for survival. And for them, they're kind of like, oh, you're nice to have. And you know what? I'm resourceful. So yeah, you're helpful to me in this moment. I have this need. Help me fulfill it. I said, help me to fulfill it. You know what? Don't worry. You are too slow for me. I'll do it myself. And I do think sometimes that my cat speaks to me in that way, which I think is wonderful. Like, how much agency does she have? It's quite nice, and then it makes me think about, I do wish that doggos also had inherently, do you know what I mean? Like could retain some of that more like negotiation and I don't know if self-determination is the right word, but just that capability. And I don't know if that's the right word too, if that's like politically correct. Maybe just, yeah, I do wish that doggos were able to be a little less dependent on the humans, because our expectations seem to align in that way where we want to live life as a human and to be happy. At the same time, we want this closeness with the animal. You know what I mean? And then I do wish that for the dogs, so that they could have a nice life being close with us and also not needing us that much.
Yeah, there's so many layers to that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Recently I heard from someone that animal-centered care is quite an extreme view, and that immediately made me feel like, wow, it shouldn't be. Like, it really just it's so basic. And so being controlling when it comes to dogs, boundaries, it is kind of perceived that is just part and parcel of being a dog parent, you know? They need to fit in with our lives. I would like to understand from your experience, how did we go from the more dominance-based model and transition to where we are now, well, some of us, to being more animal-centered? What do you think brought on that? Is it social media? Is it maybe gentle parenting?
I think it's a very good question. It's a very big question to think about how like these shifts started to happen. I think it would be quite personal to each person and their context and their experiences as well. Maybe as an example, I might talk about what my kind of transition into this way of thinking looked like. And I think this is maybe how a lot of people might also experience this, I guess, this way of thinking. But also, I want to acknowledge that it's a little bit all of the above as well, thinking about like gentle parenting, the movements when we think about children, and like starting to have a very woke generation who know the language of therapy, who have, been seeking that kind of mental health support. A lot of factors are pushing that in the land of parenting, which is then sort of transferring over to doggos, the way that we see our relationships with them. I think on a deeper layer, for my journey, I'm going to go back to creature teacher Kare. So creature Kare is a teacher for me, but so is his mum. And his mum is a post-colonial biblical scholar. There's a lot to even unpack in one title. It's incredible. Actually, I don't know that I'm going to do her work justice explaining that, but I think she was one of the first moments, like the first seed planters into thinking about the systems that we grow up in that shape our perception of the world. And actually then starting to look at, when I look out to the world, what glasses am I wearing shaped by these systems? And seeing my perception as not objective truth, but a pair of glasses informed by me and then how I've experienced the world around me. One of those layers was post-coloniality. It was that moment where I was coming into this awareness that we live in this world where we have very violent histories that still impact our lives today. And the violence, today is like similar to that early history, but like in different fonts. For me, it's a lot of like these concepts and these systems that started actually challenging a lot of how I was how I was even like seeing relationships with the people and like then animals. So in Australia, we were colonized by the British in the 1800s. Settlers arrived and termed Australia like nobody's land, when in actuality, we had Aboriginal people, Indigenous people who'd been living on this country for like such a long time. And then what followed, again, like continues to today, but like in like different fonts, but still quite harrowing, was genocide and then removal of Indigenous people from their land, from each other and from their knowledge, and then taking their land and then taking their knowledge without acknowledgement of its traditional ownership. And then today, I think there's a lot of things. There's a lot of like ramifications from that. And there's important, I guess, when we think about our setup today, it is still the same setup as what the settlers came and set up when they removed Aboriginal people, Aboriginal land. Even the idea of what Sarah and I were talking about, Kare's mum, which was my first crap, that's a lot to process. She was saying how if you think about the schooling system, right, the biggest things, like the biggest point was like what we're learning in school is this almost like a doctrine. Like we are taught to think in one way, but whose perspective are we taught? It's this perspective of, the victors of history. And, what we learn, say like science, English, maths from this like Western perspective. Like I've been aware of that as a child. Like we get taught multiculturalism at school. But then I think it really hit me then that our institutions, like schools and what we're taught at schools, is like it comes from such an old institution. And even the idea of schools was to make sure actually like kids started learning discipline and obedience to then be able to be really good workers. And then I was like, oh yeah, that's too much to think about. But then it planted a very important seed, which is where we're at and how we think and how we exist right now was not from this blank slate, neutral place. But like there's a lot of heaviness there that then shape the systems around us, right? That then shape how we grow up and what we learn. And it also shapes the language around us. Like language isn't neutral, right? But like science isn't neutral. Like I have another thing that I'm sitting with is I'm trained as an engineer, or I did my schooling in biomedical engineering, which is different to what I'm doing the master's in right now, which is behavioral science, clinical animal behavior. And when I think about engineering, we're taught to look at when presented a problem, we're taught to look at the problem in context to all of its stakeholders, all of the people and the patterns within, all of their individual needs, to then come to or start thinking about how do we create a pathway of the least trade-off. Doesn't have to be the most perfect, but just the least trade-off so that and as many needs met as possible. What would that look like? And in science, what I found was really interesting was there seems to be this, like the scientific method seems to be this pursuit of objective truth, but like
it's a temporary truth.
It's a temporary, but then it gets, and I find it so interesting. Science is really, when we're taught in school, it feels very, we think of its associations to innovation and it's transformative and it's so important, but also it came from a lot of violence as in we enacted a lot of things on on Black people, on Black folk, on animals to be able to benefit us today. And so like science isn't neutral, you know what I mean? And a huge thank you to Sarah, but also now it's a big heavy thing to sort of sit with, but I'm very fortunate to sit with it, to be able to think about, where to with this information, and where to with this awareness. And then when we think about science isn't neutral, the idea of animal, the word animal is also not neutral, I think. I think, how many times have you heard someone get called you dirty pig? Or, the B word is what we call a female dog. And it's so many layers. But when we compare that to, say, animal symbols in Indigenous culture, and not speaking for, I guess, all Indigenous cultures, I'm reading this book called Sand Talk, and it is an Aboriginal man traveling and collecting traditional knowledge from knowledge keepers. And what I hear him talk about is animal symbols in some Indigenous cultures is very different. It's not relative. It's not a relative point to human, but it's like an active source within like a living, breathing, full ecosystem. So like the word animal in our kind of context is very different to say animal and say how a native person in a certain part of China would like that the equivalent word, or say animal in an indigenous culture. So yes, I think there are then these old systems that have sort of paved this traditional way of being in relation with another being. It could be like towards another woman, towards a child. And I think as we're coming into awareness of these systems, there is then this idea of how do we like liberate ourselves from that? How do we live authentically? In my head, at least, that's kind of like what my journey is being like, is as we're coming into awareness of these things, what does it mean to live differently with an animal? Like to actually see them differently than what we've been taught to. Does that, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I
that's
think
a challenge.
yeah, it is. I recently wrote an abstract with an incredible human. She's called Valley, and she did her PhD. She did very, very cool person. She did a PhD, especially looking at animal agency and looking at Indigenous populations where she was. Yeah, recently we wrote an abstract together on animal agency, what that looks like for a dog training. I think it's a dog training journal for like questioning what does utopia look like between the human and dog, and like that's where my brain is. That's where we're sitting. That's the things that we're sitting with now. So I think on a deeper layer, I think awareness of some of these old systems helps us start thinking about how do we act differently, how do we perceive differently those around us, how do we have these new relationships. And then on a maybe more social cultural level, I think that we have this generation, I think it's like the millennials and maybe like a little bit younger than millennials is a group where we're coming into also awareness of our own mental health, of emotions, of more like healthy attachment styles. And I feel like this is a trend that there is an intention to try and do better in understanding what we do for the next generation. I think that has been a big driver of that gentle parenting movement, which then when we think about how we have relationships with our pets is very much alike that of a parent and child. And that's, I think, quite naturally the concept sort of they really float. I think it's a really cool way of looking at and teaching people about how to be with dog. Is to be quite inspired by gentle parenting, which is different to permissive parenting. I think a lot of people, I think it gets that bad rap where it's like, oh well, you're just giving everything to the kid. And I go, no, it doesn't work like that. And a very big part of it is starting to understand the underlying emotions and okay, the emotion. Let's talk about the behavior. You know what I mean? I think that also plays a big role into how we are thinking about, at least how this like upcoming group of, people with their doggos are starting to respond to their dogs.
Yeah, I think like language has a lot to do with it as well. Like we are human beings. We have a lot of feelings. Some of us are better than others at wearing or not wearing our feelings, like
Yeah.
suppressing it or finding healthy channels or self-soothing or whatever it might be. But at the core of it, it's being able to name it, to identify it. And a lot of us didn't grow up with that language. And so if we don't
Yes.
have the language and we can't identify, how on earth are we going to identify and find the language for animals, right?
Yeah.
So I think we've got more vocabulary now, perhaps, than or we're exposed to more vocabulary, especially psychological vocabulary that helps us, I guess, explain what we're observing, but also our response to those observations.
Yes, 100%. Well, Brene Brown.
Yeah.
Brene Brown has this wheel of emotions. I love it so much. I think she's a very inspirational person. But yeah, she has like that wheel of emotions was so helpful for me. And sometimes I still struggle with figuring out what is this sensation in my body? Like which emotion is it? I still struggle with that. And sometimes I wonder if it's a bigger struggle than the average person. Like sometimes I have a really hard time working out what is going on for me. I think like anger and frustration. And then I also know what hurt feels like. And I know anxiety in like how I'm starting to behave in the things that I check in on later. But there's like other things like embarrassment. And then there's all these other little emotions that I'm like, I know when I read a book how that might feel, but then I don't know that I know what it feels like in my body. So even that I think is an ongoing journey of
Yeah.
like trying to work out, like check in and know how to respond to and listen to our body.
Yeah.
But yes, 100%. I think that makes for a generation who has the capacity to see that in another being, whether it's a kiddo or even like each other, right? Like we start to
Yeah.
go, we are able to actually give each other space to be emotional folks.
Like in the beginning, how you said when you first got Bruno, he had big feelings, and then you realize, actually, I also have big feelings. And then being
Yeah,
confronted with that, I think dogs, if we care enough to learn and listen and observe, help us become better humans.
they do. And it can be very confronting. I think that's not having a kiddo, but seeing my brother with his kiddos, I can see that it's really confronting for him. And I can see it because I'm like, I think that I'm aware of this that you're not aware of, Sam. That I'm like, I think that this is reflecting something that he finds quite hard in himself, like a hurt, that then might then behaviorally look like stubbornness, that he finds quite hard to sit with in himself. I think that when that gets reflected from his kiddo, I can see him get really overwhelmed. And I think that our dogs can do the same thing for us, which is why it's such an interesting thing, like to study. What really is this? Like, what is the human animal bond? It's so many things. Like, we can read so much for them. Should we, like, when we do have the capacity to know what, potentially they're telling us, and then at the same time, it can be confronting to experience, to be like shown, to be reflected, these things that we didn't know that we get quite worried about in ourselves. And then at the same time, it can be so like fulfilling to like heal that. And then in doing that healing, you go, I've kind of repaired my own little inner child a little bit. So it is very fascinating. It can be such a big experience to be in relationship with the doggo, isn't it? It's so many things, and it just keeps up. The more that you know, the deeper that you can go.
That's so true. Actually, there's a question around that. The more that you know, the more you see that maybe the majority of the general public don't get to see,
Yeah.
potentially will never get to see. How do you deal with those feelings in terms of, based on your own experiences of what you've learned through Bruno and the other dogs in your care, but also your education? I bet you see a lot of things that others don't. And so how do you process that? Do you address it with people in a kind way? Like, what comes up for you in those moments?
I think about the two contexts where that can happen. So it's either like in behavioral consultation where we're having a conversation about the dog, and I'm going, okay, I'm starting to paint this picture of a doggo who might be finding things quite hard that I don't know, that I'm like hoping human is ready to listen to. There's one context. And then second context is just walking down the street and then just existing with other people, existing with their dogs. I'll answer the behavioral consultation one first. What's been quite interesting, and kind of what we talked about beginning of the call, whether or not it was recorded, was how I've kind of created a niche for myself. The algorithm has created a niche for me, probably because of the language that I use and the kind of things that I educate on and the style of like the talking. It is created a really wonderful community of, at its core, like people who really want to do the best by their dog with whatever like means they have available to. And I think that driver is already so much to work with, because then should I see this picture of the doggo, I know that there is a person there who really wants to be this best person or give this dog the next best step. I do think that most people, like not even within this niche, but I think that most people, when they do go to seek support and help, there is that, like, that is the underlying driver, is I want to be the best. I want to do a good thing for my doggo, right? And I've tried to find that in the human, in how they're talking, and I try to understand their needs and where the doggo has impinged on their needs, to be able to empathize with just why it's just so frustrating for them, or why it's been so hurtful for them or shaming for them. And then being able to like empathize with that, I go, I think, yeah, understandable. Like, then it's like a negotiation, right? This one has a need, but this also has a need. And like, what is within reasonable? I understand the tension. It is really hard to sit with. And then I think once human feels heard, and once I understand what the human is struggling with, then it's easy to talk about what's happening for the doggo and what the different options could be, what the different like next steps could be, what works within, like, what is reasonable for the human. I think that's for that picture. I try to remember the human on the side of the leash who really wants to do the best for their dog. And the people that I see now, that again, the algorithm has like funneled people on specific journeys for their dogs in. That's what helps me at that point. On the point of like when I go out for a walk it's actually quite hard. Like the friends who know that I get quite overwhelmed or overstimulated when I do see a doggo who's finding something quite hard, they tell me to just turn away. You hear nothing, Rose. And I go, you're so right. I hear nothing. We just keep walking, and then we just make some distance and move on. Not every moment is an educating moment. I would love to go up to someone and just be like, hey, look, I know you're wanting to do the best for your doggo. Would you like to have a chat about what that might look like? Because I can see it's having a hard time, and I can see it's really hard for you. I would love to say that to people, but how many people are wanting that on like a coffee run. You know what I
I
mean?
think if you approached it this way, loads.
Maybe.
Potentially, yeah, I would. If I was them, I'd really welcome that approach that you've just shared with me. That's lovely.
Well, that's given me some bravery. I feel like having been on social media for this long, and it's been a while. I think I've been posting on Instagram for, okay, when I say a while, 4 years. And there's like all of
Okay.
them are now archived to like, what is the most recent and reflective of Rose at this current point in time kind of posts. But yeah, I think that's also made me a little bit more wary of the kinds of opinions that people can have. And in a way, even though I would expect maybe to be a bit more desensitized to, the various comments that people might have, it's still quite hard to hear. Like, it's still quite hard to be misunderstood, I think is what it is you're not afforded time to give your context for people to know where some advice might come from. And so, yeah, I think that's what I might be worried about when I would love to be just someone to go, hey, like, I noticed you're having a really hard time. I've been quite scared to, but maybe I think we should try. I haven't in a very long time, but
Yeah.
I think we should be, we're allowed to have those, or even just to ask the question of, would you
Exactly.
like
What's
that?
the worst that can happen? That like those people feel a bit more guided, a bit more aligned, a bit more seen, a bit more heard, and the dog benefits from that. It's interesting though, because once you see, you can't unsee. And so that is a blessing and a curse in many ways, isn't it? So going back to your social media, which is how I found you, how I discovered you, maybe I fell into your algorithm or you fell into mine.
It makes
I,
sense. Sense, Nadine.
yeah,
Yeah, now that we meet each other, I go, it makes sense.
you do these things called think pieces. The ones that stand out to me is the one that you wrote about the media and how that influences our perception of dogs over time. How, extreme conformation in dogs have affected and impacted on their ability to communicate with their own species. Dogs with folds not being able to express in their
Oh,
face as they should or communicate. And then, what was the other one I really enjoyed? What it means to be an animal or like control over time.
yes. Yeah, I'm learning
So
control.
fascinating. Before we
Yeah,
go into a bit more detail with those, can you tell me what the motivation behind these think pieces were?
very good question. It's very good that you sort of picked up like that. It's pretty recent that I started dropping think pieces. So I'm second year now into my Masters of Clinical Animal Behaviour, and there was one course that was very eye-opening that forced me to spend the time to answer some of those questions that we talked about earlier, or some of those to really go into the spirals that we talked about earlier. And that was the course on anthrozoology. I'd always had these thoughts that I think there are things that are deeper than just, the training things that we talk about or the behaviors that we talk about that are also part of this picture of how, a human and dog feeling better about each other. There are these systems that we need to address, that I think once we sort of come into an awareness of, we can liberate ourselves from.
Yeah.
And so there'd always been that motivation there. I just didn't know what the delivery would look like. And in my head, I was like, do we make a YouTube video to explore this? And then anthrozoology was like a very good pushing point of, all right, we have these assignments that we have to do, which is a good thing. Like, they're very good questions that they're asking us, and it forces me to do the research and to critically think. And so that first think piece was like formalized because we had an assignment that was on. The assignment question felt simple in that it was asking, why do people bark at their dogs? It's looking at the barking at the dog trend. And like in that anthrozoology course, we learned about human psychology. We go into like human behavior. And then what I would expect that a lot of like what people might have answered that was, like social media trends, all these like social cultural phenomena. I went deep into anthropocentrism. Let's talk about the long-standing history, of how humans have been with animals. And this idea that's I think one of the big sort of theories that I really got a proper grasp on in doing this assignment. So just to briefly explain, anthropocentrism is this idea of human at the center of significance. And it's kind of how we've been conditioned to see the world. Like, everything is relative to human. And then animal is also relative to human. And relative to human because we have this idea that humans have this rationality, this self-awareness that warrants them to be recognized as the most intellectual and therefore the most significant. If that makes sense, like that self-awareness. And that's a system that's been if we like peel back the layers, even like Aristotle, back to those, like our earliest Western philosophers were reinforcing this idea of like this great chain of being leading up to human. Like all of these things had shaped our perception and had shaped our expectation, and this norm that like human and like Western human is the relative point, and then everything else is in service of, less than, or like obstructing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
lacking what they
yeah,
don't have. Yeah.
lacking to exactly. And then that's how I answered the essay question. Or that theory was where I started answering this essay question of like, there's this social media trend on TikTok where people bark at the dog, and the dog goes, "Oh my God, what?" And the dog obviously is very upset and confused. I don't think that they expected people to go this deep, because the comment was, "I've never read anything like that before." And that was an effective way of arguing. And I was like, thank you. And so the argument was, fundamentally, how we've been taught to perceive is that animal, especially pet dog has always been in service of human. We created dog for them to work for humans, and in working for humans, the I think difficult thing that I struggle to sit with is that they almost have to overlook their own needs or ignore their own bodily needs to be like
Of
to
service.
yeah, to be of service, which is, I think, so interesting. But like fundamentally, that's where the domestication of dogs was leading to, was that it's quite helpful for humans. You know, they used to sort of be on the outskirts of a Western society, and then we went, "Oh, why don't you come in? Here's some food." And then we went, "You could be useful for me. Come here. Let's get more of you." And that's quite helpful. We can do with you. Let's get more of you. And then that's how we then selectively chose who's quite biddable with the human and who's quite helpful for the human. And so fundamentally, that's then that expectation of what it means to be a pet dog for human. But then what else is interesting with the development of social media is then we get to bond over the cuteness of dogs and this, like, the funniness of dogs. So like if we go another step further, social media then like propels this way of being with the dog where we make them have these funny responses and then we're rewarded with views. So fundamentally we already have these expectations of, oh, I guess it's like reasonable or within reason that, yeah, this is something that I can do to the dog. Why do I need to think about if this makes them really upset? Because they're just, he's just a funny guy. And then on top of that, social media is very rewarding of these like big dramatic responses. And so all of that, I think over time, it does very big impacts on like at least what the next generation is going to perceive as what normal interaction with a dog looks like. And so for the assignment, that was what I was going through and talking about. And there were a lot of things that I wanted to make posts about, these think pieces about, including like thinking about colonization, thinking about what it means to decolonize the space, and all these big topics that do have a lot of imagery of violence in them, that at the time I was like, I've never posted about this in a think piece before. And I think it would be a very big thing to start off with. And I do have to ease people into thinking about these systems, like a gentle system at a time. And also to then create the expectation that we do make these kinds of posts. Like we talk about body language and we teach on behavior, but then we also make these posts that help us think about broader systems that situate our reality. And so I think that was like doing that assignment was a good prompt to start that think piece, just thinking about social media. Like, what do we do on social media? Oh, isn't it so interesting that this is how we use it? And then as we come into that awareness, then it's helpful to think about, okay, that you saw the next post was then on unlearning control, because like really that was like the crux. Like what I really wanted to get into is this piece on how do we fundamentally relate with animals? But I thought social media, because it's still so important, has such a big impact on the kind of messaging that we propagate about doggos. And it normalizes a lot of things that we do that we don't question that we should. And so I thought we'd start there, and then we would add on to that next complex layer. And then we'd add on to that next complex, like these other layers, just to get us thinking. It's not to say that I don't know that I have an answer to all these big spirals that I'm having yet. And I don't know that we'll ever have. And Sarah, who's Kare's mom, I have these like philosophical chats with Sarah. Sarah like runs through a lot of good philosophical thoughts and logic to me that helps me go, okay, you're right. Everything's not just falling apart. And one of the things that she says that is very helpful, it's not the point to have the answer to things, because that in itself is kind of like science going, I can find a universal truth and there is an objective reality, when actually everything is a little bit relative to our own lived experience and interpretation of the world, right? And so she's like, that's actually, you don't have to, like, the point is not to have this answer, but to sit in a place where we're thinking about these things and where we create a hospitable space for other people to join in and walk through that door, or to like grow a seed into fruition, is like a very nice thing to do, if that makes sense. And so, yes, that's the root of what we've been doing, the think pieces, how we've been doing the think pieces, and also a tad on how do I reconcile the bigness of it all and the awareness while actioning and living.
When I think about our conversation just now, I do recognize that there will be a few people who will potentially resonate. So I'm going to call this my selfish episode because really this scratches an itch for me. I would love to be a fly on the wall of your brain, because I think it is super interesting to open that door and walk through that door and just, lean in with curiosity. It's quite nice to be around or have a discussion with someone who's just like, let's just explore, let's just unpick this thread and see where it leads. So the think pieces, from my perspective, is exactly that. Like, how does the media, not just social media, but also movies, Disney, impact on our perception of dogs and, how we bond with them and how we live with them, but then going a step further, okay, how does that impact on them? Not just our perspective and where that came from, but like, how does that actually affect them and influence their day-to-day life?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. Unlearning control. I would love to go into that ever so slightly, because I think someone said to me recently, when it comes to your dog, you need to be firm but fair. And I thought,
I'm like, there's so much nuance that could trickle into that.
that's
The piece on unlearning control, that was a big one. I was actually, any Instagram post that I make feels like a taking of a chunk of my heart, because I think about how to deliver this message. It's a very big message to say, like, someone who's just going to visit Instagram on a Thursday after work. What is that going to be like for them when I want to open a door? I don't want to close a door. I don't want to stick a finger up to anyone. I just want to go, hey, did you know that there's this door? And so there's so much time that goes into making the post that then when it goes out to the world, I'm like, it's in the hands of the world now. It's up to them how they want to interpret it. I just wish for the best. I get really anxious about, like, the day after I post the post, I actually don't look at my phone at all. I'm like, I'll get to it. I'll get to the comments, and I just hope that it lands in people who have good faith, that I have good faith. And that unlearning control post, I've never been that anxious in making a post like that, because it is very heavy. And then there were comments of like, this is the biggest BS I've ever seen in my entire life. And I go, okay, at least I know that it's gaining enough traction that it's getting, hate speech. But it was a very big post, because it can be interpreted in a lot of ways. It can be taken to, justify why aversive training is not good. It can be, and a lot of people can then take that and then, add more fire to it. So I was like, oh gosh, it's going to be quite scary how this will, but the message is more important than my anxiety. The foundation of that post is it also comes from that, it's a combination of assignment 1 in anthrozoology that looked at why fundamentally do people bark at their dogs? And I went, let's talk about anthropocentrism. The second assignment was then a research proposal on just like generally people and dogs, like within the field of anthrozoology. There's like with every post, there's also a lot of inspiration with every assignment that then like turns into a think piece. There's a lot of like personal inspiration that then like leads to the write-up and then the design of the post. So leading up to it, there was already this like burning fire of I need to talk about anthropocentrism, because as a part of like unlearning what we've been conditioned to value. But there's also other layers. There's also other layers in, say, like when we think about femininity, when we think about masculinity that we know of, surely that's playing a role. Like we see these performances, if you will, of being a certain way, parallel to how people are with dogs. And I was like, there are a lot of layers to unpack there. And so what sort of catalyzed that, aside from anthropocentrism, but then adding on to that, looking at gender, looking at all these other spaces, was in my spare time, to not think about dogs, I do burlesque. And in the burlesque community that I'm in, it's a really wonderful community where we get to play with gender. We get to challenge what we've been taught are the norms of the the binaries that we sit in: feminine, masculine. And within this community, there are some incredible performers. One of them, who's actually a drag king, and had come to Sydney to do a workshop on. The workshops were defined as, feminine flow and like mask, just to put like labels on it, but really they're very fluid in how they express themselves and their identity. So I was like, I'm just very inspired by how comfortable this person is in their skin, and I want to learn how they are so comfortable performing this desirability and like embodying it in front of a crowd. And it's just very empowering. Like, why I do burlesque is, I think there's a lot of things, including it's like helping me learn and unlearn things about my body, about just what we're taught about identity. But it's also a way to like liberate, to actually embrace these feelings that we like don't give ourselves permission to. So in this workshop, the drag king is called Charles, and he was showing us like this routine where they're moving in a very like sensual way, and they've got this like very intense gaze in the mirror, like very intense stare, that I was like, I felt immediately I wanted to hide in a very, it feels so predatory. Like, I don't like it. It feels so intense. And then they paused because they see that I was like, I don't know, I feel comfortable sitting with that. And they're like just talking me through what this setup was, like what's just happened. We are in this safe space where we are getting to explore, like, objectively, this like very sensual gaze. If we then, like, there is that objective, like the sensual gaze, there's also the associations of what that can feel like, especially when it's non-consensual and then when it's with a non-consenting person, because it is very much like we're moving in like a gender bending way. We started talking about, what does masculine, like, what do I understand of masculinity? And I was like, that's a very good question, because when I think about a lot of the media that's like that sort of feel like my thoughts about it, it feels like masculinity feels very predatory, and it feels very non-consensual, and it feels very like imposing. But then Charles was like, okay, those are associations. What about if we think about just this behavior as this objective moment of, if we're both consenting partners, and if I'm like sharing with you and holding this gaze with you in that moment, and I'm enjoying it, and you're like, are you able to then enjoy it, given that consent has been given from both people too? And then I was like, true, I guess it's like different to, like, that's a separate thing to this imposing and like really like macho kind of way of being, right? And that's when I was like, oh, crap, like there's things to unpack. There are a lot of things to unpack now in just my understanding of how we express ourselves. And then of course that sort of trickled into, well, when I think about how people are with doggos, it feels like it's this picture, like especially when I see videos of people who, have like, maybe, I don't know how to describe the music, but very like epic kind of music with like a really, a dog who's like, yeah, like I do the heel, I'm right here. And like, and they've got like, full gear on, which feels like that. It gives me that feeling of, like that kind of, it's very imposing. It feels very imposing. If I were to ascribe a gender presentation to this video, this feels really like hyper mask, like that kind of mask of like and that's when I started thinking, yeah, like I wonder, especially on this platform of social media, is there a role? Is there a performance that happens in this interaction? Could this be seen as a performance? What is this? Is there a performance of a kind of gender in how, like, in how people are with their dogs? And is that significant? Like, is it to say, is there this feeling of hyper mask is very powerful, or is very, is
In
the
control.
most
Yeah.
in control? Yeah. Yeah. And so that second assignment, what I then started deep diving into, basically this, like dog training cultures and the intersection of gender, thinking about if there is this performance of a gender in how people appear with their dogs. And then through that, so for this post, we went into control from the perspective of human and animal. There is this like hierarchy that we're taught, and therefore for an animal to be in relation to a human, they must be under control, they must be subordinate. And then I thought, when it comes to gender, there is also, like when we think about the gender intersections then on control, I think even say like being a woman in this field can also be weaponized. Like it can be like your emotions are weaponized, because I think emotions are then ascribed to like feminine. Even though if I like take away what my associations towards feminine and masculine have been and just think of them as like, if I were to put descriptors of like what I feel like good role models within its category, sometimes I actually would ascribe emotionality and like compassion to masculine as well as like assertive and authoritative, but in like the guys in Lord of the Ring kind of way, where they are protective and they're quite what's the word?
Nurturing?
It's nurturing. I like the word nurturing, and hospitable. Like I think about those as masculine things, but if I think about, what we've been conditioned to see these presentations of gender to be, I can see that emotionality has been ascribed to this feminine way of being. And I do think that then can be weaponized as weaker, or like they're being too permissive to the dog. I think that's a very interesting, and not saying this isn't something that, I've done a full study on. I would be very curious to. I think that'd be very interesting to explore. But I do see some of those patterns there, in that there is this perception of a kind of masculinity that is very powerful, like that is like celebrated, and that kind of trickles into what is perceived as valuable in how people are with dogs, as is with kids. And then on the other side, being nurturing, being emotional, and like expressing emotions is seen as like you're not, dare I say, civilized, therefore, and you're not under control. And that was the neatest way that I could package that post without getting too into it, and also without making it too personal, without being able to give the context to it. Like, this is the important part is, I've been doing burlesque just to explore identity, just to understand myself. And this is where these thoughts are coming from. So yeah, that post was hopefully enough to plant seeds, not too personal, but just enough to go, we got to think about these things. Like when you get really upset at this video, why? And when you get really upset at, say, like someone being nurturing to the dog, why? Why does that make you upset? As say with me, like when I see a video of someone being really like domineering with a dog, why does it make me upset? Yeah. Yes. So those were it's very interesting to think about the gender layers, the anthropocentrism, like how we've been taught to relate to animal layers, and how we then interact with the dog, and why we felt like control is the right way, and then what it looks like to not be like in such a way with animal.
Yeah. And then also, I guess, like taking it a level further, how to sit with the feelings of uncertainty when you are unable to control something that is a completely separate being with its own experience and its own feelings and its own everything.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because I guess that's where we have to accept that this creature and me as a creature, we have our own agency, we have our own thoughts and wants. And ultimately, even today, and it's hard, like this is the hard part, because I'm trying to do this for you that I think might be helpful for you. So if you just collaborated with me, that would be good. You try to say that with the animal, and the animal's like, no, I don't think that's a safe thing to do. I disagree with you, and that's irrelevant. I cannot do that right now. This is more important. And it can be like frustrating, even today. So with our cat Toff, what she's been struggling with is we've kind of poisoned medication, and that we've hidden it in foods, and it's been too potent that she's gone, you know what? That's in the shape of a ball. We're not doing that. So what we're having to teach Toff is build up this system where she understands when she comes onto this mat and positions her head a certain way, it's a start button for I pop a pill in and they give her a treat at the end of it. But it's a very slow process of building it up. And then adding to that, she is cat in that she will tell me when she's had enough and she's quite bored and she's done. Or like she'll be like, this feels very unsuccessful for me and that's frustrating. I don't want to do it. I give up. So it's like like working with that time frame. Today, she'd been out. We have a little courtyard that she likes to have a hunt in, and then she came back, so sprawled out on the floor. And I was really excited to tell my partner. I was like, "Hey, look, we've gotten to this point with Toff. Toff will do this." And then I got everything set out. I got the mat set out. I have a little target stick for her, and I was like, "Yeah, are you ready? Are you ready? We're gonna do this thing." And then Toff like gets really excited because she knows this setup and she knows the treats. And then I have the target stick out, and then she does it once or twice. She's like, "I boop it, cool. I boop it, cool." And then she sort of finishes and she looks at the stick, and then she's like, and then she like notices something else, and then she notices something else, and I'm like, "Oh," I'm like, no, I really want to show the human what we've been able to do. And then I'm also like a little bit sleep deprived. I like felt this frustration at myself, because I'm like, I just want to keep pushing through. Like, I just wait through it. Click, time the clicker wrong. And I was like, it just got in my head about it. And then my partner said something. They're like, she's a cat. She's like wanted to do something else. She's cat, like you're human, and she's cat. She wanted a different thing. You wanted a thing, and then she wanted a different thing. And I was like, it's true. And she was like, Top will also have hard days, good days, bad days, days where she doesn't really want to do something. And I was like, it's true. And then, of course, there will be other contexts where, you want this collaboration, you want this thing to do together, and then you're just on sort of two different wavelengths. And
Not
it
working,
is,
yeah.
it would be frustrating for both. And I guess you do get to acknowledge that for yourself, that, gosh, that was frustrating, maybe because I wanted to do a good thing for this, that they don't realize is important for them to be able to have a good day tomorrow. But then the animal, like the kiddo was like, no, that's not I disagree. And it's frustrating. I guess in that moment you just go, it's okay, little Rose. It's okay. Like, it's not that big of a deal, actually. It's not going to kill you.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it is hard.
Lovely. It is hard. We are
Yeah.
confronted with those experiences wherever we go, whether it's,
Yep.
in parking or driving or at work with colleagues or bosses and then family members and, you know, again, dogs, the government, social
Yeah.
media, the media, everywhere, right? It's like you have your agenda, I have my agenda. You have your
Yeah.
agenda, I have my agenda. We're all fighting
Yeah.
for our needs. And yeah, it's interesting what comes up when those needs aren't being met or when we're
Yeah.
unable to communicate what those needs are in a clear, calm, and confident way.
Even in acknowledging that we do have our own agenda is actually giving so much legitimacy and credibility to
Yeah.
actually us being emotional beings, like, who deserve our own emotionality and who deserve the liberation and the like agency to be emotional beings.
That is a bit of an aha moment,
Yeah.
because when you can identify that you're feeling that rise of emotion, however big or small it might be, you're then able to identify, okay, this is me needing to realign my expectations, instead of cry and scream because you're not doing what I need you to do right now. Why not? Da, da, da. My life would be so much easier if you just.
Uh,
And, we have that with dogs, but obviously we can't speak each other's language. Most of us, for me, it's still a journey with Duna, but just a teeny tiny example I was reflecting on yesterday is like, since I've had her for the last month, I've been trying to take her out for a wee 4 times a day. She doesn't even have to, but just give her the opportunity and the routine and the structure that she knows she doesn't have to worry. Right. So
yeah.
good intentions. So yeah, she has a harness. And after the morning wee, in the afternoon, she doesn't want me to put the harness on. So I started interpreting that as this little game that we play. I show her harness and she goes, and I'm like, oh, come on, we're going to go for a walk. You're going to love it. I just need to get you downstairs and you're going to have a sniff. And
You haven't we need you to wee.
exactly, this isn't wee number 2. Like, we need to go for wee number 2 because I don't want to clean up anything in case it happens indoors. I don't want to have any accidents. I want to make sure that you are comfortable and structured and that you make the most of this opportunity that I've given you. So it's like once I started realizing that actually she has a potential injury that I'm currently looking into, I started realizing, shit, I'm forcing her to go downstairs up and down 2 flights of stairs 4 times a day. This 8-year-old galgo, and she's been trying to tell me, actually, I don't want to go for a wee right now. I'm comfortable up here. And so there were moments within the last month where I felt niggles of frustration where I was like, why won't you just go for a wee? Because then I can relax. So going back to those feelings and being confronted with them, and being able to self-reflect, but also recognize in the moment my agenda isn't serving her, and tuning
Isn't
into
that
her needs will make our bond stronger.
Yeah, it's such a big thing for you to, like, reflect on it. It's such a big moment for her. Like, it would have made her feel really understood, even though it feels like a small thing where you just go, "Okay, I guess I'll just oh, okay, I kinda okay, fine, we don't have to." 'Cause they're so attuned to our social pressure. Every time we have intention, like, if I'm like, "Kat, you're gonna get on the table because we're gonna do this thing," it's like it's a shift in the air that they feel. They're like, "You want me to do this thing?" Even if, say, like, we're, like, ready to go home, I might, like, slightly turn my body to go, and then it's like, she wants to go home. I don't know already. Like they feel that. So that the fact that we then take the pressure off, if we just go, oh, okay, you know what? Like I can recognize this is something that's making me quite upset. Maybe there's a few things that I can put in place to like soothe that. And like, should the worst case happen, let me just accept that because you have this need right now. And you know what? It can just be that. It doesn't reflect anything about me. It is just a, okay, and like this is a you thing that does such a big thing for her.
Massive, yes. It did make a difference, and we continue to build on that. But that is seen in lots of things. Going for a walk, we're going this way. No, but they want to sniff that way. I see it all the time. No, we're going here. Sometimes it might be for safety. Sometimes it might be a lack of time. Someone having their own agenda or urgency to get somewhere. So I think relating this back to control and the subconscious need for control and order and structure and my way, it's really taxing to shift that brain and mindset from
No.
human-centric, me-centric to animal-centric. Let me try and figure out what you need in this moment and whether I can meet you there.
Yeah. It's
Right.
big. We're working it out. I guess that's like living it and letting it be emotional is doing it. That's doing it. That is like, we kind of talked about before we jumped on this podcast, like being in relationship with another sensitive person. Like it just is more sensitive and emotional. And you do have to just have more conversations about when things are like what things are hard. How do we navigate that together? And how do we show up for each other given we're both big feeling sensitive people. I guess that's the same thing that we're doing for the doggo, and in that case it's like we're living it. We're asking this question but we're also living it.
Yeah.
So
And
keep
it
on it.
benefits us, it benefits them, and it benefits our relationship together. Yeah. So many different things we touched on. If it opens the door for anyone, even one single person, this was worth it. If anyone has made it this far, I commend you. Well done for sticking with us. And I hope you got so much from this conversation. Rose, where can people find out more about you? I will put your details in the show notes anyway, but what's the best way to reach out to you, and what for?
Yeah, great question. So I think the best way to find out more about me and the work that we talked about today is to go on Instagram and search at Rose, Rose, letter K, number 9, behaviorist with a U. So yeah, spelt with a U in the middle. That's where a lot of these like big thoughts and the research that we're doing, the questions that we're asking gets put into quite digestible form, as well as more education if you want to know more about behavior, body language, how we go about rehabilitation. That's where to go. And I would say from the Instagram page you can actually press email. Email is the best way to get in contact, and I will definitely get back to an email because it does not get lost. Sometimes on Instagram it can kind of get lost in a DM pile. So best way to reach out is by emailing.
And do you have anything exciting coming up that I should be aware of, we should be
Wow.
aware of?
A lot of exciting things coming up. Although I will say, I keep saying this, that we're humans in progress. We're always learning as we're going. I would say I'm a lot more skilled as a practitioner than I was, years ago. There's still so much that I'm learning with every doggo case, especially I'd say, like 70% of my caseload right now are dogs where there's evidence of chronic pain, like pain or discomfort that's lasted more than 3 to 6 months. And there is so little research on what is this journey, what is rehabilitation, what is long-term best practice for a doggo who presents with pain. As there is, it's still a place where we're exploring that for humans. And so with every dog case, I have an incredible team who works with me. With every case, we learn so much about the dog and so much about what is really healing for the human and dog here. So I guess just keep on that page, because we just keep learning, and there are going to be projects coming out based on what we've learned.
Are you working on a think piece? If so, what is it about? What's the next one?
It's a good question. There's so many thoughts, lots of thoughts going on up in here. The next think piece is thinking about how do we reconcile. So in, say, Western medicine, we're very big on pathologizing, like this is a problem, mental health is a problem, or this physical ailment is a problem. And that can be quite shaming. It can be very like, what if people don't have the resources to do this kind of best practice way for this problem? And so that's something that I'm sitting with, is how do we decolonize medical practice, behavioral support for dogs, for dog behavior? And that, I think, is going to have to be an all-nighter research and then conceptualize, because there's a lot to learn from like radical models in human mental health. Is even like thinking about what is the role of the therapist, of the person who is supporting the person in need, how much involvement, say, like we have in Western perspective, best practice, there is a professional distance. And we do have to think about how, we've been taught to be only this much involved for the person. But what if it's a community effort? In human mental health, there is such a thing as like, what's it called? Mutual aid, where we rely on community, including the practitioner, to do a little bit of that practical support to help the person, whether it is starting to look at how do you raise funds for this, or how do you help connect this person to people. So there are lots of different things to explore to help human and dog outside of what we're learning in the institution. That's going to give me my letters to be able to say, great, I'm now a clinical animal behaviour. That there's still more to explore. So that's what I'm sitting with, that I don't have answers about. And the think piece is just going to be about how we got to think about these things. I don't have answers, but we're sitting with it. And I guess in a way, I do have to, another phrase that Sarah teaches me is like learn the tools of the master to then take it down, right? Like we do have to still sit in this system and then grow within this system and understand the depths of how it works before we then think about like radical ways to change it. And so
100%. It's a Mr. Miyagi moment.
Mr. Miyagi moment.
Wax on, wax off. She sounds like an amazing, not coach, but like just, someone who kind of is quite reflective about like giving you guidance and helping you.
Well, you're going to have to talk to Sarah. You'll have to talk to Sarah I think she's like definitely busy she's doing her PhD now. It's like, but yes, she's had a lot of life. She's lived a lot of life, Sarah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time on a Saturday in the evening, joining me all the way from Sydney, Australia. I am so, so grateful, and I'm so glad we finally got to have this conversation. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
It tickled my heart. My heart is chocolate liquiding right. It doesn't have the same ring when I say
liquid chocolate.
Yeah. This is something that tickles my heart too. It really does. That's why I have a lot of enjoyment doing it in my spare time. I really appreciate this opportunity, Nadine.
It's my absolute pleasure. I could not have you on here. Amazing.
Oh.
Rose, I wish you a lovely rest of your weekend. And thank you for coming on.